I'm Sarah Matthews, 34, and I thought I had the perfect marriage. For 8 years, David and I built what I believed was an unshakable foundation of love, trust, and shared dreams. We had our rituals anniversary dinners at the little Italian place where he proposed, weekend morning coffee in bed, his habit of leaving sweet notes in my lunch bag. So when our 8th anniversary passed without so much as a happy anniversary, I was devastated. David came home late that night, distracted and distant, claiming he'd been swamped at work. I tried to brush off the hurt, telling myself that people forget sometimes, that work stress happens. But 3 weeks later, while looking for our insurance documents in his desk drawer, I found something that shattered my world completely. Wedding, venue contracts, catering deposits, flower arrangements, all dated for next month. All with a name that wasn't mine. My husband hadn't forgotten our anniversary. He was too busy planning his wedding with someone else. What I discovered next about the woman he chose, and the web of lies he'd spun, would change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the man I'd shared my bed with for nearly a decade. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by photo albums I'd pulled from the closet, trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. 8 years of documented love stared back at me from glossy pages, or first date at the farmer's market, the camping trip where he taught me to fish, our wedding day when he cried as I walked down the aisle. David and I met at a conference in Chicago. I was presenting my marketing research on consumer behavior, and he was there representing his architectural firm. He approached me after my presentation, genuinely interested in how my findings could apply to designing public spaces. We talked for hours over coffee, then dinner, then walked along the lake until sunrise. Those early months felt like discovering a missing piece of myself. David was thoughtful, ambitious, and surprisingly tender. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk, that I was allergic to shellfish, that I called my mom every Sunday. When he proposed 18 months later, it felt inevitable, not rushed, but like we'd been moving toward that moment from the very beginning. We built our life carefully. I transitioned from my demanding consulting job to freelance work, so we could travel more, so I could support his growing practice. When his firm landed the contract for the new downtown arts center, I celebrated like it was my own victory. We bought this house together, painted every room, planted the garden where he promised we'd someday teach our children about tomatoes and patience. But looking at these photos now, I could see things I'd missed. In the recent ones, David's smiles seemed forced. His hand on my shoulder looked more like a pose than affection. When had that started? When had he begun looking past me instead of at me? The changes had been subtle. More late nights at the office, weekends spent on site visits, that I never questioned. His phone face down during dinner, his attention elsewhere even when his body was present. I'd attributed it all to the stress of his expanding business, the demands of success. I found our anniversary album from last year's dinner at Marcello's, the same restaurant where he'd proposed. I remember that night clearly now. He'd seemed distracted, checking his phone twice during dinner. When I'd mentioned planning a trip for our upcoming 8th anniversary, he'd been non-committal, saying work was too unpredictable. Work? How many times had I heard that excuse? How many dinners had grown cold while I waited for him to come home from the office that, apparently, had become his second life with another woman? The cruelest part wasn't just the betrayal, it was how completely I'd believed in us. How thoroughly I'd trusted him. How willingly I'd rearranged my life to accommodate his dreams while he quietly planned a future that erased me entirely. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on client presentations when my world was crumbling. David left for the office as usual, kissing my forehead and asking if I was feeling better, the same caring gesture he'd performed thousands of times. Now feeling like another layer of his performance. After his car disappeared down our street, I went back to his desk. The wedding contracts were still there, along with a credit card statement I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't one of our joint accounts. The name read David G. Outdoor Matthews. His middle initial was J, not a dot. My hands shook as I examined the charges. Tiffany & Co., $12,000. La Bernardine, New York, $400. The Ritz-Carlton, Manhattan, $800. Weekend trips to cities where I'd never been. Expensive dinners I'd never shared. Jewelry purchases that had never appeared on my finger. The dates told their own story. The Tiffany purchase was 3 months ago, around the time I'd mentioned wanting to upgrade my modest engagement ring for our anniversary. He'd deflected, saying we should save money for the house renovations. Apparently, saving money meant not spending it on me. I found receipts tucked behind the contracts. Lingerie from La Perla, a weekend spa package for two in Napa Valley. Flowers, delivered weekly to an address I didn't recognize. Each piece of evidence was a small knife twist, showing me how extensively he'd been living a parallel life. The credit card had been opened 2 years ago. 2 years of systematic deception, of building a relationship with someone else while coming home to kiss me goodnight. The balance was staggering, nearly $50,000 in charges for dates, gifts and trips with his secret fiancée. I photographed everything with my phone. My journalism training kicking in despite my emotional chaos. Evidence, documentation, proof of what he'd done, though I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. The most devastating discovery was a handwritten note tucked between the contracts. My darling Melissa, I can't wait to start our real life together. No more hiding, no more excuses. Just you and me, forever. Real life. As if the 8 years we'd shared were just a dress rehearsal for his actual existence. I searched through his other desk drawers, finding a second phone charger I'd never seen before. Of course, he'd need a separate phone for his separate life. The systematic nature of his deception was breathtaking. This wasn't an affair that had spiraled out of control. This was calculated, methodical, and cruel. The financial statements revealed something else troubling. Several large transfers from our joint savings account to this secret credit card, labeled as home improvements. I remembered those conversations, David explaining that we needed to move money around for tax purposes, that his accountant had recommended it. I'd trusted him completely, signing whatever papers he put in front of me. Our savings account, which had contained nearly $80,000 6 months ago, now held less than $15,000. He'd systematically drained our shared resources to fund his romance with another woman, my inheritance from my grandmother, money I'd contributed from my freelancing work, the wedding gifts from our families, all of it had subsidized his betrayal. The scope of his deception was expanding with every document I found. This wasn't just infidelity, it was fraud, theft, and a complete reconstruction of reality. I sat surrounded by evidence of how thoroughly my husband had erased me from his future, while pretending to build one with me. The name Melissa Torres was written on several of the contracts. I stared at it, this collection of letters that represented the destruction of my marriage. Who was she? What did she know about me? Did she even know I existed? I opened my laptop and searched for her on social media. Within minutes, I found her Instagram, at @Melissa_Torres_NYC. The photos that greeted me were like looking into an alternate universe of my own life. There she was with David at a restaurant I recognized, the same place he'd taken me for my birthday 2 years ago. Another photo showed them at a Broadway show, her head on his shoulder, both of them smiling with the easy comfort of an established couple. The timestamps revealed the truth. These dates with Melissa had happened on the same weekends. He'd told me he was visiting his mother in Boston. Melissa was beautiful in a way that made me understand why David had been drawn to her. She had long dark hair, bright eyes, and a smile that seemed genuine and unguarded. She looked younger than me, maybe late 20s, with the kind of effortless style that suggested money and confidence. Her bio read, marketing director at Creative V, dog mom to Bentley, engaged to the love of my life. The engagement announcement post was from 3 months ago, the same time as that Tiffany purchase. The ring in her photos was stunning, a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting, surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like captured stars. I found the receipt in David's papers. $15,000. 3 times what my wedding ring had cost. I scrolled through months of her posts, watching her document a relationship I had no idea existed. Photos of weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, date nights at exclusive restaurants, couples yoga classes, art gallery openings. She'd been living the life I thought I was living with David. What struck me most was her obvious happiness. In every photo, Melissa glowed with the kind of joy that comes from believing you've found your person. Her captions were full of gratitude and excitement about their future together. Brunch with my favorite human, read one. Can't wait to marry this amazing man in 6 weeks. Read another. Posted just last week, she had no idea that her amazing man was already married. No idea that while she was planning their wedding, he was coming home to kiss another woman goodnight. The cruelty of David's deception extended beyond me. He was setting up Melissa for the same devastating betrayal I'd just experienced. I found photos of her with friends at what appeared to be bridal showers and bachelorette parties. Her friends looked happy for her, celebrating what they believed was a beautiful love story. One photo showed her with her parents, an older couple beaming with pride at their daughter's engagement. David had convinced this woman to plan a wedding, to introduce him to her family and friends, to believe in a future that was built on an enormous lie. She was as much a victim as I was. Just a few weeks behind me in discovering the truth. The engagement ring receipt was dated the same weekend. David had told me he was attending a conference in Philadelphia. I remembered that weekend clearly. I made his favorite dinner for when he returned, excited to hear about his presentation. He'd come home with flowers and stories about boring seminars and networking events. The entire time, he'd just proposed to another woman. I screenshotted everything, building a digital file of evidence. Melissa's wedding countdown posts, photos of her dress shopping, pictures of the venue, the same venue whose contracts I'd found in David's drawer. She was planning a wedding that would never happen, building dreams on a foundation of lies. She couldn't see. Looking at her innocent happiness, I felt something I hadn't expected: protectiveness. This woman deserved to know the truth before she walked down the aisle to marry a man who was already married, who had systematically stolen from his first wife to fund their relationship. David hadn't just betrayed me. He was about to destroy her too. The deeper I dug into David's deception, the more elaborate his lies became. Hidden behind other papers, I found documents that made my stomach drop. Divorce papers with my name on them, supposedly finalized 2 years ago. They were expertly forged, complete with fake court seals and judicial signatures. This was how he'd explained away his marriage to Melissa. In her world, David Matthews was a divorced architect who'd learned from his past mistakes and was ready for true love. The narrative was perfect, sympathetic enough to explain any lingering complications, but clean enough to promise a fresh start. I wondered what stories he'd told her about me. Was I the bitter ex-wife who'd taken half his assets? The workaholic who'd grown apart from him? The woman who hadn't understood his dreams? Had he painted me as the villain in their love story? Reading through Melissa's social media posts with this new context, I found subtle references to David's difficult divorce. She'd written about being grateful that he'd trusted her with his painful past and how proud she was of his healing journey. One post mentioned how patient she'd been during his legal complications, the times when he couldn't travel or make weekend plans, because, unbeknownst to her, he had a wife at home. The fake divorce papers showed David's attention to detail. He'd researched court procedures, legal language, and filing requirements. The papers even included a fabricated property settlement that explained why he still lived in his house, the house where I'd lived with him for 5 years, where I'd painted the kitchen and planted the garden. I found a manila folder labeled background info that contained what could only be described as a dossier on our marriage. David had documented our relationship from his perspective, creating a version of our history that cast him as the victim of an increasingly distant and career-obsessed wife. He'd noted specific arguments we'd had, reframing them to support his narrative of an unhappy marriage. According to his notes, I'd become emotionally unavailable after my career setbacks. He'd documented times when I'd worked late or traveled for clients, presenting them as evidence of my abandonment of our relationship. The cruel irony was that many of those late nights had been spent working extra hours to contribute more to our shared financial goals. He'd even prepared explanations for why he couldn't introduce Melissa to his family immediately. According to his timeline, his parents were still processing the divorce and needed time before meeting someone new. In reality, his parents called me regularly and still considered me their daughter-in-law. The folder contained printed emails between David and Melissa from their early relationship. Reading them felt like witnessing the birth of a lie. In their first exchanges, David presented himself as recently divorced, healing from betrayal, and cautiously open to love again. Melissa's responses showed a woman falling for a man she believed was being vulnerable about his past. "I admire how honest you're being about your divorce," she'd written in one email. "It shows real growth that you can acknowledge your part in what went wrong." What she didn't know was that David's honesty about his failed marriage was complete fiction, designed to make her feel special for being the woman who could heal his broken heart. The most chilling discovery was a timeline David had created, mapping out his dual life. He'd scheduled his relationship with Melissa around his obligations to me, treating our marriage like a work commitment to be managed around his real priorities. Business trips became romantic getaways. Late nights at the office became dinner dates. Weekend conferences became couples retreats. He'd managed this deception for 2 years, maintaining to complete relationships with military precision. Every lie had been calculated, every excuse pre-planned. This wasn't a man who'd fallen into an affair, this was someone who'd methodically constructed an alternate reality and inhabited it while pretending to live in mine. The sophistication of his deception was breathtaking and terrifying. If I hadn't accidentally found those wedding contracts, how long would he have continued this double life? Would he have actually gone through with marrying Melissa while still married to me? The legal implications alone were staggering. Big fraud, theft. The wedding David was planning with Melissa wasn't just any wedding, it was the wedding of someone's dreams. Every detail had been carefully considered, every vendor researched and selected. The venue was the Foundry in Long Island City, with its stunning views of the Manhattan skyline. The same venue I'd once bookmarked in my Pinterest board, titled Someday. The guest list was what truly staggered me. I recognized nearly half the names, our mutual friends, colleagues from David's firm. Even some of my own friends who had apparently been invited to witness David marry another woman. How had he explained away my absence? Was I the bitter ex-wife who couldn't handle attending? The unstable woman who'd made threats? Marcus Chen, David's best friend and business partner, was listed as the best man. The same Marcus who'd been at our wedding, who'd given a speech about how perfect David and I were together. Either Marcus was complicit in this elaborate deception, or David had fed him the same lies about our divorce. The catering contract showed a menu that was almost identical to what we'd served at our wedding: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetable medley, and David's favorite chocolate bourbon cake. Was this unconscious habit, or was he deliberately recreating our wedding with his new bride? The flowers were white roses and peonies, my favorite flowers. The same flowers I'd carried in my bridal bouquet, the same ones David brought me every anniversary. Either he lacked imagination, or he was systematically replacing me with an upgraded version in the same role. The most painful detail was the custom invitations. They were elegant, expensive, and featured a photo of David and Melissa on the beach, the same beach where David and I had honeymooned in Santorini. The invitation text read, "David Matthews and Melissa Torres invite you to celebrate their love story as they begin their journey as husband and wife." Love story. As if their relationship existed in a vacuum. As if there wasn't already a wife whose story was being erased to make room for theirs. I found the photographer's contract and recognized the name Elena Rodriguez, who'd shot several weddings for David's clients. She was talented and expensive, known for her ability to capture authentic emotion. The irony wasn't lost on me that David had hired someone famous for authenticity to document his life built on lies. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, October 14th, just 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to plan my response to this betrayal. 3 weeks before David would stand at an altar and commit bigamy while his legal wife sat at home, theoretically unaware that her husband was marrying someone else. The honeymoon itinerary was tucked behind the other contracts. 2 weeks in Italy, Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast. The same trip David and I had taken for our 5th anniversary, the same hotels where we'd celebrated our love. He was recreating our entire relationship template with Melissa, as if I'd been nothing more than a rough draft for his real life. The seating chart showed careful consideration of family dynamics. Melissa's parents were at the head table, along with her siblings and their spouses. David's parents were positioned prominently, apparently having overcome their alleged difficulty with his divorce. My former in-laws, who still sent me birthday cards and Christmas gifts, were listed as enthusiastic attendees at their son's wedding to someone else. The most crushing realization was that this wedding was happening in 3 weeks, and I was the only person who knew it was illegal. Every guest who'd RSVP'd, every vendor who'd been hired, every family member who'd planned to attend, they were all unwitting participants in David's fraud. I found the final payment schedule for the wedding vendors. David had liquidated nearly all of our remaining joint assets to pay for this celebration. The venue's final payment was due next week, $15,000. From the account that had once contained my grandmother's inheritance, he was stealing from me to pay for his wedding to another woman. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also his biggest mistake. Financial fraud left paper trails, created legal vulnerabilities, and gave me concrete evidence of his crimes beyond just adultery. As I sat surrounded by the debris of David's wedding plans, I realized that I held the power to stop this charade, but I also realized that simply stopping it wasn't enough. David had methodically destroyed our marriage, stolen from me, and was about to devastate an innocent woman who believed she was marrying a divorced man. Justice required more than just preventing the wedding. It required exposing the truth in a way that would have consequences for the damage he'd done. I sat on our bedroom floor, still surrounded by the evidence of David's betrayal, and pulled off my wedding ring for the first time in 8 years. The thin band of white gold had left a permanent indentation on my finger. A physical reminder of promises that had apparently meant nothing to the man who'd made them. The ring felt impossibly heavy in my palm. Heavier than it had on my finger for nearly a decade. I thought about the day David had slipped it on, how his hands had shaken slightly with emotion, how he'd whispered that he couldn't wait to spend forever with me. Had any of it been real? Or had I been living in a performance that I'd never known was happening? My first instinct was to call David immediately, to scream at him over the phone, to demand explanations that would never satisfy me, but years of working in crisis communications had taught me that emotional reactions rarely produced the best outcomes. I needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to handle this devastating revelation. I called my sister Emma instead. "Sarah, why are you calling in the middle of a Wednesday? Shouldn't you be working?" Emma's voice was bright and unsuspecting, unaware that my world had just imploded. "Emma, I need you to sit down." The concern in her voice was immediate. "What's wrong? Are you hurt? Is it David?" Where could I even begin? How do you tell someone that your seemingly perfect marriage was an elaborate lie? That your husband was planning to commit bigamy in 3 weeks? David is planning to marry someone else. In 3 weeks, I found the wedding contracts. The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean, marry someone else? You're married to David." That's exactly the problem. I spent the next hour walking Emma through everything I'd discovered: the wedding plans, the financial fraud, the fake divorce papers, Melissa's innocence in the whole scheme. With each detail, Emma's shock transformed into rage. "This is insane, Sarah. This isn't just cheating, this is criminal. You have to call the police." "And tell them what?" "That my husband is planning to marry someone else." "They'll tell me to file for divorce." "No, they'll tell you to file charges for fraud and theft. He stole your inheritance, Sarah. He drained your joint accounts to fund his relationship with another woman. That's not a marital dispute, that's a crime." Emma was right, but calling the police felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. Despite everything David had done, part of me still couldn't fully process that the man I'd loved for 8 years was capable of this level of deception and cruelty. "I keep thinking there has to be an explanation," I admitted. "Something I'm missing, some way this makes sense." "Sarah, listen to me, there is no explanation that makes this okay. None. He didn't accidentally fall in love with someone else while thinking he was divorced. He systematically planned this. He stole from you. He lied to everyone you heard, your friends, your family. This isn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This is calculated psychological and financial abuse." Hearing Emma say it so plainly broke something loose in my chest. I started crying, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose foundation had just crumbled completely. "I don't know what to do," I managed between sobs. "I don't know how to even begin to handle this." "You start by protecting yourself," Emma said firmly. "You document everything you found, you get copies of all those financial records, and you call a lawyer. Today, before David realizes you know." She was right. Every moment I delayed gave David more time to cover his tracks, to move money, to spin new lies. If I was going to fight back, I needed to move quickly and strategically. "Will you help me find a lawyer? I'm already Googling divorce attorneys who specialize in fraud. I'm also calling Mom to see if she can recommend someone. And Sarah, you're not going through this alone. Whatever happens next, we're going to handle it together." After I hung up with Emma, I sat in the silence of our bedroom and tried to reconcile the man I thought I'd married with the evidence spread across our carpet. How do you grieve a relationship that was apparently never real? How do you trust your own judgment when you've been so thoroughly deceived? The wedding ring was still in my palm, warming to my body temperature. I placed it on the dresser next to a photo of our wedding day, David and I laughing as we cut our cake. Both of us glowing with happiness that I'd believed was mutual. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back. But tonight, I needed to mourn not just the end of my marriage, but the death of my faith in my own ability to recognize truth from fiction. That evening, David came home at his usual time, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and asking about my day with the same casual concern he'd shown for 8 years. Watching him perform normalcy while I sat on the couch, knowing everything was almost surreal. "You still look pale," he said. pressing his hand to my forehead. Maybe you should see a doctor if you're not feeling better tomorrow. The tenderness in his gesture made me feel sick. How could someone touch you with such apparent care while systematically destroying your life? How could he ask about my health while stealing my financial security? After dinner, David settled into his office to work, or so he claimed. I waited until I heard the familiar sounds of his evening routine, the shuffle of papers, the click of his keyboard, the low murmur of a phone call I couldn't quite make out. While he worked, I used my laptop to access our shared cloud storage account. David had set it up years ago to sync our photos and documents between devices. What he apparently hadn't considered was that his phone backup was automatically saving to the same account. What I found there was worse than the wedding, contracts, months of text messages between David and Melissa, intimate and immediate in a way that made my stomach turn. I watched their relationship develop in real time through their conversations. From tentative early flirtation to deep emotional connection to wedding planning excitement. Good morning, beautiful, David texted Melissa most days. Can't wait to see you tonight. These messages were sent at 7 a.m., usually while David was drinking coffee with me in our kitchen, reading the news on his tablet. Last night was incredible, Melissa had written after one of their dates. I can't believe how lucky I am to have found you. David's response, the luck is all mine. You've made me believe in love again, as if what we'd shared hadn't been love, or hadn't counted, or had been some lesser version of what he felt for her. The photos were perhaps the most devastating. Hundreds of pictures of David and Melissa together, intimate moments, casual selfies, romantic dinners. David looked happy in these photos in a way that I couldn't remember him looking with me recently. His smile was unguarded, his body language relaxed and affectionate. There were photos from trips I'd never known about. A weekend in Martha's Vineyard where David was supposedly at a conference. A romantic dinner in Boston when he'd claimed to be visiting his sick mother. Beach photos from Cape Cod during what he'd told me was a client site visit. In one particularly painful series of photos, David and Melissa were at a couple's cooking class, laughing as they prepared what looked like pasta from scratch. The date stamp showed it was from the same weekend David had told me he was too stressed to do anything and had spent the entire Saturday in bed claiming he had a migraine. The conversations revealed the depth of their planning together. They discussed everything from honeymoon destinations to future children's names. Melissa sent David links to houses for sale in Westchester, talking about their someday family home. David responded with enthusiasm about their future, making plans that extended years into the future. I can't wait to wake up next to you every morning, David had written. No more sneaking around, no more complicated schedules. Just us, building the life we want. Complicated schedules. That's how he described maintaining a marriage. While conducting an affair, the most recent messages showed their excitement about the upcoming wedding. Melissa was stressed about final details, the cake tasting, the seating arrangements, her mother's dress choice. David reassured her with messages that showed genuine care and attention to her concerns. Everything is going to be perfect, he'd written just 2 days ago. I promise you, this is going to be the most beautiful day of our lives. Our lives. Not her life, not his life, but their shared life that he was building on the ruins of mine. I found photos of Melissa's engagement party, an event that had happened while David was supposedly working late on the Arts Center project. She looked radiant in a flowing dress, surrounded by friends and family who were celebrating what they believed was a beautiful love story. David was in every photo, playing the role of devoted fiancé with apparent ease. The messages also revealed how David had managed his double life logistically. He'd created elaborate schedules, maintained separate calendars, and developed a complex system of alibis. When Melissa wanted to spend more time together, David would create work emergencies. When I wanted to plan couple time, he'd manufacture conflicts with Melissa's schedule. Reading through months of their intimate conversations, I realized that David hadn't just been cheating on me, he'd been living a completely separate emotional life. These weren't just physical betrayals, but deep emotional connections that had developed over time. He'd shared his thoughts, dreams, and vulnerabilities with Melissa in ways that he'd stopped sharing with me long ago. The cruelest discovery was how David talked about me in his messages to Melissa. When she asked about his ex-wife, he described me as someone who'd never really understood him, who'd been more interested in her career than our relationship. He'd rewritten our entire marriage as a story of incompatibility and gradual drift, erasing the love, support, and partnership I believed we'd shared. As I scrolled through hundreds of messages, I realized I was seeing not just evidence of David's betrayal, but documentation of how thoroughly he'd convinced himself that what he was doing was justified. The next morning, while David was in the shower, I accessed our bank accounts online. What I found made my hands shake with rage. Our joint savings account, which had contained $78,000 6 months ago, now held $8,247. The checking account we used for household expenses had been systematically drained through a series of transfers, labeled home improvement and business expenses. I printed out 6 months of statements, watching our financial security disappear line by line. $15,000 transferred to David's secret credit card in July, $12,000 in August, $20,000 in September. Each transfer corresponded to major purchases for his wedding: the venue deposit, the catering down payment, the photographer's fee. The most devastating discovery was what had happened to my inheritance. When my grandmother died 2 years ago, she'd left me $45,000. With a note saying she hoped it would help David and me buy our first home together. I'd deposited it into our joint account, trusting David when he said he'd invest it wisely for our future. The statements showed that money had been the first to disappear. David had transferred it to his secret account in large chunks, then used it to fund the early stages of his relationship with Melissa. My grandmother's final gift to me had paid for David's romantic getaways with another woman. I found records of purchases I'd never authorized but had apparently co-signed for without realizing it. A $8,000 credit card in both our names that David had used exclusively for Melissa-related expenses. A personal loan for $25,000 that he'd taken out using our house as collateral, then immediately transferred to his secret accounts. The loan documents showed my forged signature. David had apparently perfected my handwriting over the years, practicing until he could sign my name convincingly enough to fool bank officials. The loan officer's notes indicated that both spouses had been present for the application, but I'd never set foot in that bank. Going deeper into the financial records, I discovered that David had also opened several store credit cards in my name. Nordstrom, Tiffany, even a credit card for a high-end lingerie boutique. All of them had been used to purchase gifts for Melissa, then left unpaid, damaging my credit score without my knowledge. The scope of the financial fraud was staggering. David hadn't just stolen from our joint accounts, he'd systematically destroyed my individual financial standing. My credit report, which I pulled for the first time in years, showed missed payments on accounts I'd never opened, outstanding balances on cards I'd never used. I found evidence that David had even cashed out my retirement account, claiming spousal access rights to withdraw the funds for family emergencies. The $23,000 I'd saved over 5 years of disciplined investing had been liquidated and transferred to his secret account, incurring massive tax penalties that would show up on our joint tax return. The pattern was clear. David had methodically liquidated every asset we'd built together, then used my identity to access credit I'd never authorized. He'd stolen not just from our marriage, but from my individual financial future. I calculated the total theft at nearly $180,000, entire shared savings, my inheritance, my retirement account, and the loans taken out in my name. David had funded his entire relationship with Melissa using money that belonged to me, then left me responsible for debts I'd never incurred. The cruelest aspect was the timing. Many of the largest transfers had happened on dates that should have been significant. To a sour wedding anniversary, my birthday, the anniversary of my grandmother's death. While I'd been celebrating what I thought were meaningful moments in our marriage, David had been systematically robbing me. I found email receipts showing that David had even used my grandmother's inheritance to pay for Melissa's engagement ring. The $15,000 Tiffany purchase had been funded by money my grandmother had left specifically for David and me to build our life together. Instead, it had become a symbol of his commitment to someone else. The banking records also revealed how David had planned to handle the financial aspects of his bigamous marriage. He'd been gradually moving assets into accounts that only he controlled, setting up financial structures that would have left me with nothing while he started fresh with Melissa. I found applications for new credit cards in David's name only, with addresses I didn't recognize. He'd been preparing to disappear financially, leaving me with the debts and destroyed credit, while he began a new life with clean financial records. The most disturbing discovery was a life insurance policy David had taken out on 6 months ago. The beneficiary was listed as David A. Matthews using that same false middle initial from his secret credit card. The policy was for $500,000, and David had been paying the premiums using money from our joint account. I stared at the insurance documents, trying to understand why David would need life insurance on a wife he was planning to abandon. The implications were terrifying. Was he planning to fake my death somehow? Was this part of an even more elaborate scheme to erase me completely? The financial evidence painted a picture of systematic, calculated theft that went far beyond simple adultery. David had committed identity theft, forgery, and fraud on a massive scale. He'd stolen my financial security, damaged my credit, and left me legally responsible for debts I'd never incurred. But the evidence also gave me power. Financial crimes left paper trails, and David had been sloppy in his confidence that I'd never discover his deception. Every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every fraudulent account opening was a federal crime with serious legal consequences. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt something other than devastation. I felt the stirring of strategic anger, the kind that leads to action rather than despair. Chapter 10. The Support Network. Kemma had found me a lawyer. Lisa Chang specialized in complex divorce cases involving fraud and had agreed to see me that afternoon on an emergency basis. Her office was in downtown Portland, in one of those glass towers that made you feel like serious business happened there. I walked into Lisa's office carrying a banker's box, full of evidence, every document, every printed email, every financial statement that proved David's systematic betrayal. Lisa was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an immediately reassuring presence. "Tell me everything," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Start from the beginning." I spent an hour walking Lisa through the discovery, watching her take detailed notes and occasionally ask clarifying questions. She didn't show shock or surprise, just the focused attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "The financial fraud is extensive," Lisa said, reviewing the bank statements. "Identity theft, forgery, unauthorized use of marital assets. We're looking at multiple felonies here. The life insurance policy is particularly concerning." "What does that mean legally?" "It means your husband has committed crimes that go far beyond adultery. The district attorney would be very interested in these financial records." Lisa leaned forward. "But before we discuss criminal charges, let's talk about protecting you immediately." Lisa explained that my first priority had to be securing whatever assets remained and preventing David from doing further financial damage. She walked me through emergency procedures, freezing joint accounts, placing fraud alerts on my credit reports, documenting everything for potential criminal prosecution. "The bigamy attempt gives us significant leverage," Lisa continued. "If he goes through with marrying this woman while still married to you, that's a felony in Oregon. But we can't wait for that to happen. We need to act now to protect your interests." She handed me a legal pad filled with notes. "Here's what we're going to do immediately. First, I'm filing for an emergency asset freeze. Second, we're going to the police with the fraud evidence. Third, we're serving David with divorce papers that include criminal allegations." "How long will all of this take?" "The emergency motions can be filed today. The asset freeze should be in place by tomorrow morning. As for the divorce and criminal proceedings, that depends on how cooperative David decides to be once he realizes you know everything." Lisa's matter-of-fact approach was exactly what I needed. She treated David's elaborate deception as a legal problem to be solved rather than a personal catastrophe to be mourned. Her competence made me feel like I had an ally who understood the battlefield. "What about Melissa?" I asked. "She has no idea she's about to marry someone who's already married." "That's complicated. Legally, she's a victim of David's fraud just like you are. Morally, she deserves to know the truth before she makes a catastrophic mistake. But strategically, we need to be careful about how and when that information gets revealed." Lisa explained that if Melissa learned the truth too early, she might warn David, giving him time to hide assets or flee. But if we waited too long, she'd go through with a wedding that would traumatize her and complicate the legal proceedings. "I recommend we coordinate with law enforcement on the timing," Lisa said. "Let them advise us on when to inform Ms. Torres as part of their investigation." The thought of involving police made everything feel more real and more serious. This wasn't just a marital dispute anymore, it was a criminal investigation with multiple victims and potential jail time for David. "I need you to understand something," Lisa said, her voice gentle but firm. "What your husband has done to you is not normal marital betrayal. This is systematic abuse, financial, emotional, and psychological. The level of planning and deception involved suggests someone who has no remorse about destroying your life for his benefit. Hearing it stated so plainly was both validating and terrifying. For days, I'd been questioning my own reaction, wondering if I was overreacting or being too dramatic. Lisa's professional assessment confirmed that David's behavior was criminal, not just hurtful. What kind of consequences is he looking at? If prosecuted fully, multiple felony charges for fraud, identity theft, and attempted bigamy. We're talking about potential prison time, not just financial penalties. The systematic nature of the crimes and the amount of money involved put this in serious felony territory. Lisa handed me a retainer agreement and a detailed action plan. I'm going to be very direct with you, Sarah. Your husband has declared war on your financial and emotional security. We need to respond accordingly. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice and protecting you from further harm. As I signed the retainer agreement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding those wedding contracts. Hope, not hope for reconciliation or explanation, but hope that there would be consequences for what David had done, that I wouldn't have to absorb this betrayal silently. One more thing, Lisa said as I prepared to leave. Don't confront David about any of this until we've secured the asset freeze and filed the police report. Right now, he doesn't know that you know. That's our biggest advantage, and we can't afford to lose it. Walking out of Lisa's office, I felt like I'd just enlisted in a war I'd never wanted to fight, but for the first time in days, I felt like I had weapons of my own. Lisa had recommended a private investigator named Jake Morrison, someone she'd worked with on complex fraud cases. I met him the next morning at a coffee shop downtown, carrying a manila envelope with photos of David and basic information about his routines. Jake was not what I'd expected. Instead of the stereotypical rumpled detective from movies, he was professional and methodical, more like a forensic accountant than a gumshoe. He listened to my story without judgment, taking notes on a tablet and occasionally asking specific questions about timing and locations. Your lawyer is right, we need comprehensive documentation before your husband realizes you're onto him, Jake said. Right now he's operating under the assumption that his deception is working perfectly. That makes him careless, and careless people leave evidence. Jake explained that his job was to document David's double life in ways that would hold up in court. Photos, video surveillance, witness statements, and timeline documentation that proved the systematic nature of his deception. The wedding is in 2 weeks, Jake continued. That gives us a narrow window to gather everything we need. I'm going to need you to help me understand his patterns, where he goes. When he's supposedly working late, what his normal routines look like. I walked Jake through David's weekly schedule as I understood it. Tuesday and Thursday client dinners that often ran late. Weekend site visits that took him away for entire days. The monthly conferences that required overnight travel. I'm betting most of those are actually dates with Melissa, Jake said. We're going to verify that. I'll also be documenting their relationship activities, particularly any evidence that shows David misrepresenting his marital status to others. Jake showed me some of his equipment: discrete cameras, GPS tracking devices, audio recording equipment. The technology was more sophisticated than I'd imagined, capable of documenting David's activities without his knowledge. There's something else I need to investigate, Jake said, consulting his notes. That life insurance policy your husband took out on you. The timing and beneficiary structure are unusual enough that we need to understand his intentions. The life insurance issue had been bothering me since I'd discovered it. Why would David need a large life insurance policy on a wife he was planning to abandon? Jake's expertise in investigating fraud made his concern about it even more unsettling. What are you thinking? I'm thinking your husband has been planning this deception for a long time. And he's considered multiple scenarios for how it ends. The insurance policy suggests he's prepared for possibilities beyond just divorce. Jake assigned me homework for our investigation. I was to maintain normal routines with David while secretly documenting anything unusual, phone calls, changes in his schedule, new behaviors or patterns. I was also to copy any additional documents I found and note any conversations that seemed significant. The key is acting completely normal, Jake emphasized. If David suspects you know anything, he'll start covering his tracks immediately. We need him to maintain his current patterns until we have everything documented. That evening, I watched David with new eyes. He came home at his usual time, kissed me hello, and asked about my day with what appeared to be genuine interest. His performance was flawless, caring husband, concerned about my lingering illness, planning our weekend like a man who had no other obligations. "How was your day?" I asked, the question now loaded with meaning I couldn't show. "Busy, the Arts Center project is hitting some snags with the city planning department. I might need to work late tomorrow to sort it out." A lie. According to Melissa's social media, tomorrow was her bachelorette party, which meant David would be free from his obligation to maintain contact with her. He was probably planning an evening alone, or perhaps handling last-minute wedding details. "That's too bad. Anything I can help with?" "No, just boring bureaucratic stuff. Nothing you'd want to hear about." I nodded sympathetically while internally cataloging his deception. Every lie he told me now was evidence. Every false explanation was documentation of his systematic dishonesty. After David went to bed, I received a text from Jake. "Surveillance begins tomorrow. Maintain normal routines. Don't check your phone excessively. Act like someone who trusts her husband completely." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 8 years, I had trusted David completely. I'd believed his explanations, accepted his absences, and never questioned his loyalty. Now I had to pretend to be that trusting person while secretly documenting his betrayal. I looked at David sleeping beside me, his face peaceful and untroubled. How could someone live with such elaborate deception and still sleep soundly? How could he kiss me goodnight while planning to marry someone else in 2 weeks? Tomorrow, Jake would begin gathering the evidence that would expose David's double life. Within days, we'd have proof of everything: the affair, the financial fraud, the systematic lies that had defined our marriage for 2 years. But tonight, I lay in bed next to my husband, pretending to be asleep while planning his downfall. The woman who'd trusted him completely was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that love without truth was just another form of betrayal. Jake's surveillance was more effective than I'd imagined. Within a week, he'd documented David's double life with photographic precision. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Photos of David leaving his office early and driving to Melissa's apartment. Video of them having intimate dinners at expensive restaurants. Documentation of him checking into hotels with her using credit cards I'd never seen. Every image confirmed what I'd already known but somehow made it more real. The most damaging evidence came from David's bachelor party weekend. While he'd told me he was attending a conference in Seattle, Jake had followed him to a luxury resort in Napa Valley where David was celebrating his upcoming marriage with friends who apparently knew nothing about me. "This is the smoking gun," Jake said, showing me photos from the bachelor party. "Your husband's best friend gave a toast about how happy he was to see David finally finding true love after his difficult divorce. Everyone at this party believes David is a divorced man, about to remarry." The photos showed David laughing and relaxed, surrounded by men I recognized: his business partner Marcus, college friends, even his brother Tom. All of them were celebrating David's upcoming wedding, apparently convinced that I was his ex-wife, rather than his current one. Jake had also managed to record some conversations from the party, using sophisticated audio equipment. In one particularly damaging recording, David was heard saying, "I never thought I'd trust anyone enough to get married again after what Sarah put me through, what I put him through." Even at his bachelor party, David was rewriting our marriage as a story of my betrayal rather than his. "The hotel reservations are the final piece," Jake continued, showing me printed confirmations. "David has reserved the honeymoon suite at the same resort where you're having your wedding for the night after the ceremony. He's planning to consummate his bigamous marriage while technically still married to you." Lisa had warned me that this evidence would be painful to review, but I needed to see everything before we moved forward. The systematic nature of David's deception was important for the criminal case. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated, long-term fraud. The private investigator's report revealed details I'd never suspected. David had been introducing Melissa to his extended family as his fiancée, including relatives who'd attended our wedding. His cousin Rebecca, who'd been my maid of honor, had apparently hosted an engagement party for David and Melissa at her home in Sacramento. "How is this possible?" I asked Jake. "How did he convince everyone that we were divorced?" "He didn't have to convince everyone, just the people who mattered for his new life. Your mutual friends here in Portland. He's been avoiding or making excuses too. The family members and old friends who've met Melissa live far enough away that they wouldn't naturally run into you." Jake's investigation had also uncovered something troubling about David's financial planning. He'd been gradually moving assets into accounts under his middle name, David Anthony Matthews, creating a separate financial identity that would allow him to disappear from our joint obligations. He's been preparing for this transition for at least a year, Jake explained. This isn't someone who fell in love and made bad decisions. This is someone who systematically planned to erase his first marriage and start over with a clean slate. The most disturbing discovery was that David had been researching legal ways to declare me missing or deceased. Jake had found searches on David's work computer for information about death certificates, missing person procedures, and life insurance claim processes. I think your husband was exploring multiple exit strategies, Jake said carefully. The bigamy plan seems to be his preferred option, but he's been preparing alternatives in case that became too complicated. The life insurance policy was looking more sinister every day. Combined with David's research into death certificates and his systematic theft of my financial assets, it painted a picture of someone who'd considered multiple ways to eliminate me from his life permanently. What's our next step? I asked. We coordinate with your attorney and law enforcement. The wedding is in 6 days. We need to decide whether to stop it beforehand or let it proceed far enough to document the attempted bigamy. Lisa had already filed the emergency asset freeze, which would be executed the morning of David's wedding. By the time he tried to access our joint accounts for wedding expenses, he'd discovered that his financial fraud had been exposed. The plan was elegant in its justice. David would learn about my discovery at the moment he was trying to finalize his betrayal. The wedding venue would be filled with guests who'd been deceived about his marital status. Melissa would learn the truth before making the biggest mistake of her life. But the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and David might flee or find ways to protect himself legally. Too late, and an innocent woman would marry someone who was already married, potentially making her an unwitting accessory to his crimes. As I reviewed Jake's comprehensive report, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering David's betrayal: anticipation, not for revenge, but for justice. David had systematically destroyed our marriage, stolen my financial security, and was about to devastate another innocent woman in 6 days. The careful deception he'd maintained for 2 years would finally collapse under the weight of truth. The only question was whether I'd have the strength to watch it happen. Saturday morning arrived, clear and beautiful, perfect weather for a wedding that would never be completed. I woke up early, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. Today, David's elaborate deception would finally collapse. David had left the house before dawn, claiming he needed to handle last-minute vendor issues at the venue. In reality, he was probably getting ready for what he believed would be the happiest day of his life. He had no idea that Lisa had already coordinated with law enforcement and that officers would be waiting at the foundry when he arrived. I spent the morning getting ready with the care of someone preparing for battle. I chose a simple black dress appropriate for a funeral, which is essentially what this was. The death of my marriage, the end of David's deception, and possibly the destruction of Melissa's dreams. Lisa had arranged for me to arrive at the venue just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The timing was crucial, late enough that all the guests would be seated, but early enough to stop Melissa from walking down the aisle into a legal nightmare. The drive to Long Island City felt surreal. I was about to confront my husband at his wedding to another woman, surrounded by people who believed I was his ex-wife. Some of them were friends who'd celebrated my own wedding to David 8 years ago. The foundry was decorated beautifully. White roses and peonies, my flowers adorned every surface. String lights created a romantic atmosphere against the industrial backdrop. It was exactly the kind of wedding I might have planned for a renewal of our vows, if David hadn't been planning it for someone else. I could see guests through the windows, dressed in their finest clothes, chatting and laughing as they waited for the ceremony to begin. David's parents were in the front row, beaming with pride at their son's happiness. They had no idea they were about to witness his arrest. Lisa met me at the entrance, flanked by 2 plainclothes police officers. Detective Rodriguez introduced himself and explained the plan. They would wait until David and Melissa were at the altar, then approach him before any vows were exchanged. The goal is to minimize trauma for Ms. Torres while maximizing the legal impact of the attempted bigamy, Detective Rodriguez explained. We need him to demonstrate clear intent to go through with the illegal marriage. Inside, I could hear the string quartet beginning the processional music. My heart was pounding so hard I thought others might hear it. After 2 weeks of planning and gathering evidence, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Through the glass doors, I watched David take his position at the altar. He looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, nervous but happy, as he waited for his bride. For a moment, seeing him like that, I felt a stab of the old pain, grief for the man I'd thought he was, sorrow for the marriage I'd believed we'd shared. The bridal music began, and Melissa appeared at the back of the room. She was breathtaking in her gown, radiant with joy and anticipation. Her father walked beside her, proud and emotional. Neither of them knew they were walking into a nightmare. As Melissa made her way down the aisle, I saw David's face transform with what appeared to be genuine love and happiness. That was perhaps the most painful part, realizing that his feelings for Melissa might be real, even though his freedom to marry her was based on lies. When Melissa reached the altar and took David's hands, the officiant began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of David Matthews and Melissa Torres in marriage. That was the signal. Detective Rodriguez and his partner moved through the crowd, their badges visible as they approached the altar. The guests began murmuring, confused by the interruption. David Matthews, Detective Rodriguez said clearly, his voice carrying across the room. You're under arrest for bigamy, fraud, and identity theft. The silence that followed was deafening. Melissa's face went white as she looked between David and the officers. David's expression shifted from confusion to panic as he realized what was happening. I don't understand, Melissa said, her voice barely audible. What's happening? Detective Rodriguez looked at her with compassion. Ms. Torres, I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Matthews is already married. The marriage you're about to enter into would be illegal. The gasps from the assembled guests created a wave of shock that seemed to ripple through the room. David's parents looked stricken. His best friend Marcus was staring at David with an expression of complete bewilderment. That's impossible, Melissa said, turning to David. You're divorced. You showed me the papers. For the first time, David's eyes found mine across the room. The look on his face was a mixture of rage, panic, and something that might have been relief. His carefully constructed double life was finally collapsing, and he knew it. The divorce papers were forged, Detective Rodriguez explained gently. Mr. Matthews has been married to Sarah Matthews for 8 years. She's here today. Every head in the room turned toward me as I stepped forward. Some of the guests recognized me, people who'd been at our wedding. Mutual friends who'd been told I was David's bitter ex-wife. Melissa looked at me with an expression of complete devastation. You're his wife. I am, I said simply. I'm sorry, Melissa. You deserve so much better than this. David finally found his voice. Sarah, please, let me explain. Explain what? I interrupted. How you stole my inheritance to pay for her engagement ring, how you forged my signature on loan documents, how you've been planning to commit bigamy while I believed we were working on our marriage. The handcuffs clicked around David's wrists as Detective Rodriguez read him his rights. The sound echoed in the silence of the decorated wedding venue, punctuating the end of his elaborate deception. Melissa stood frozen at the altar, still holding her bouquet, her wedding dress suddenly seeming like a costume for a play that had been canceled. Her parents rushed forward to comfort her, their own shock and confusion evident. As David was led away, he looked back at me one more time. I never meant for it to happen like this, he said. But you meant for it to happen, I replied. That's what matters. The beautiful wedding venue had become a crime scene, decorated with flowers that would never celebrate a union, filled with guests who'd been unwitting participants in an elaborate fraud. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow in the face of so much devastation, mine, Melissa's, and even David's. Though his was entirely self-inflicted, the aftermath of David's arrest was swift and devastating. Within hours, the story had spread through our social circles, our professional networks, and our families. The man everyone had thought they knew, successful architect, devoted partner, charming friend, had been revealed as a systematic fraud. Police report filed that afternoon detailed the full scope of David's crimes: attempted bigamy, identity theft, forgery, and fraud totaling nearly $200,000. The charges were serious enough to carry potential prison sentences, not just financial penalties. Melissa called me that evening. Her voice was raw from crying, but she was surprisingly composed for someone whose life had just imploded. I need to understand, she said without preamble. How long were you married? When did you suspect? I told her everything: the forgotten anniversary, the discovery of the wedding contracts, the months of investigation that had led to today. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that showed she was processing the full scope of David's deception. He told me you were emotionally abusive, Melissa said quietly, that you'd made him feel worthless, that you'd never supported his dreams. He said the divorce had been ugly and that you'd tried to destroy his business out of spite. Each lie David had told about me was another small wound, but I found I wasn't angry at Melissa for believing them. She'd been as manipulated as I had been, just in different ways. None of that was true, I said. I supported David's career, often at the expense of my own. Our marriage had problems, but I never suspected he was capable of this level of deception. The engagement ring, Melissa said, her voice breaking. I need to give it back, don't I? It wasn't really his to give. It was bought with stolen money, I confirmed gently. But Melissa, you're a victim here too. David defrauded you just as much as he defrauded me. The next few days brought a parade of revelations as David's lies unraveled completely. His business partner Marcus called me, apologetic and shocked. He'd had no idea David was still married and had genuinely believed the divorce story. The firm was conducting an internal audit to determine if David had misused business funds as well. David's parents reached out through Emma, too ashamed to call me directly. They'd been told I was his ex-wife and had been planning to welcome Melissa as their new daughter. Learning that they'd been celebrating their son's planned bigamy while his actual wife sat at home, unaware, was devastating for them. The criminal investigation moved quickly. David's lawyer advised him to plead guilty to avoid trial, acknowledging that the evidence was overwhelming. Lisa explained that cooperation might reduce his sentence, but he was still looking at significant jail time. Financial fraud of this magnitude, combined with the attempted bigamy, puts him in serious felony territory, Lisa said during one of our meetings. The prosecution is pushing for a sentence that reflects the systematic nature of his crimes. The media attention was limited but intense. A local news station picked up the story as an example of modern bigamy, interviewing legal experts about the challenges of investigating fraud in the digital age. I declined all interview requests, but the coverage helped explain to our community why David had suddenly disappeared from his normal life. The most difficult conversations were with friends who'd been unwittingly complicit in David's deception. Several couples admitted they'd been confused by conflicting stories about our marriage but had chosen to believe David's version rather than ask uncomfortable questions. We should have reached out to you, my friend Jennifer admitted over coffee. David said you'd become bitter about the divorce and that contact with mutual friends upset you. We should have verified that instead of just accepting his explanation. The audit of David's business revealed additional fraud. He'd been using company funds for personal expenses related to his relationship with Melissa, then covering the missing money with falsified invoices and expense reports. The firm was considering pressing separate charges. Melissa and I began communicating regularly, bound together by our shared experience of David's betrayal. She was seeing a therapist to process the psychological manipulation she'd endured, and she encouraged me to do the same. He didn't just lie to us about facts, Melissa observed during one of our conversations. He rewrote reality completely. He made us both believe in a version of him that never existed. The financial recovery was proceeding better than Lisa had initially expected. The asset freeze had preserved most of the remaining marital funds, and David's guilty plea included restitution requirements. The house would need to be sold to cover the debts, but I wouldn't be left financially destitute. David's cooperation with the restitution process is probably motivated by his desire to minimize his sentence, Lisa explained. But regardless of his motivations, you'll recover most of what he stole from you. 2 weeks after the failed wedding, I received a letter from David, written from the county jail where he was being held pending sentencing. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive. I know nothing I say can justify what I did to you and Melissa, he wrote. I told myself that I was trapped in a marriage that had died, that I deserved happiness even if it meant lying to get it. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me, that the divorce would happen eventually anyway. But I know now that I was just making excuses for inexcusable behavior. I stole from you, lied to you, and planned to abandon you in the cruelest way possible. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the damage I've done. The letter felt like too little, too late, but it was an acknowledgement of responsibility I hadn't expected. David was finally admitting the truth about what he'd done, even if it was only after being caught and facing serious legal consequences. The man I'd loved for 8 years was gone not because he'd died, but because he'd never really existed in the first place. David's sentencing hearing took place on a gray December morning. 3 months after his arrest, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, filled mostly with legal professionals and a few reporters covering What had become a notable white-collar crime case? I sat in the gallery with Emma and Melissa, who had insisted on attending to see this chapter of our shared nightmare finally close. David's parents were there too, looking aged and broken by their son's crimes. The man they'd raised had become someone they no longer recognized. Judge Patricia Hernandez reviewed the case with the thoroughness it deserved. She detailed the scope of David's fraud, the identity theft, the forged documents, the systematic theft of marital assets, and the attempted bigamy that would have made his crimes even more devastating. Mr. Matthews, Judge Hernandez said, looking directly at David, you conducted a 2-year campaign of fraud against your wife, and Ms. Torres. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a crime of passion. This was calculated, systematic betrayal that required extensive planning and continuous deception. David stood to receive his sentence wearing an orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the tailored suits he'd worn during his double life. He looked thinner than I remembered, diminished by the collapse of his elaborate lies. For the charges of fraud and identity theft, I sentence you to 4 years in state prison. For the attempted bigamy, an additional 2 years to run consecutively. You will serve a minimum of 5 years before being eligible for parole. 6 years. David would be in prison until I was 40 years old, until Melissa was in her mid-30s. The sentence felt both too long and not long enough. Nothing could restore the years of deception or repair the psychological damage he'd inflicted. The judge also ordered comprehensive restitution. David would be required to repay every dollar he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties, his share of our house sale, his retirement accounts. Even his life insurance policies would be liquidated to satisfy the judgment. Additionally, Judge Hernandez continued, you are permanently prohibited from obtaining credit in your wife's name, or opening any financial accounts that could impact her credit. These restrictions will remain in place indefinitely. The divorce decree had been finalized the week before, dissolving our marriage and formally ending the legal relationship David had betrayed so thoroughly. I was officially free from him, though the emotional work of healing would take much longer. After the sentencing, David's lawyer approached me in the hallway. David wanted to speak with me before being transferred to state prison. Against Lisa's advice, I agreed to see him one final time. The meeting room at the county jail was stark and institutional, separated by thick glass with communication through phones. David looked exhausted, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. I know you didn't have to come, he said, his voice barely audible through the phone. I came for me, not for you, I replied honestly. I needed to see this end. I keep trying to understand how I became this person, David said. How I convinced myself that destroying your life was acceptable if it meant I could have what I wanted. That's something you'll have to work out with a therapist, I said. I can't help you understand yourself anymore. David nodded, accepting the boundary I was setting. Melissa wrote to me, he said. She's doing well. She said you've been helping her process everything. We help each other. We're both rebuilding from the damage you caused. I'm glad, David said, and I believed he meant it. I know I have no right to ask this, but I hope someday you'll both be able to forgive me. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, I said. It's about what I need to heal. But that's my work to do, not yours. When our time was up, David pressed his hand against the glass in what might have been a gesture of goodbye or apology. I didn't reciprocate. That part of my life was over. Walking out of the jail into the cold December air, I felt lighter than I had in months. Justice had been served. Not just in the legal sense, but in the cosmic sense of truth finally being acknowledged and consequences finally being faced. Lisa was waiting in the parking lot with the final paperwork for the financial settlement. The restitution would take years to collect completely, but the initial payments had already begun restoring my financial security. How do you feel? Lisa asked as we reviewed the documents. Free, I said, surprising myself with the simplicity of the answer. For the first time since I found those wedding contracts, I feel free. The legal chapter of David's betrayal was finally closed. He would spend the next 6 years in prison, thinking about the choices that had led him there. Melissa and I would spend that time rebuilding our lives, learning to trust again, and discovering who we were beyond the lies we'd been told. The house sold quickly in the spring, allowing me to pay off the debts David had incurred in my name and start fresh somewhere new. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my life from the wreckage of his deception. 6 months after David's sentencing, I signed the lease on a 1-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District. It was smaller than the house David and I had shared, But it was entirely mine, chosen by me, decorated according to my taste. Financed with money I'd earned myself. The apartment hunting had been surprisingly emotional. For 8 years, I'd made decisions about homes with David's preferences in mind. I'd learned to love his favorite colors, to accommodate his need for a home office, to choose furniture that suited his aesthetic. Standing in empty apartments, trying to imagine my life in them, I realized I'd forgotten what I actually wanted in a living space. I chose a place with large windows that filled the main room with natural light. The kitchen was small but efficient, perfect for someone who was relearning to cook for one. The bedroom had a view of the river, and I could see the mountains on clear days. It felt like a place where I could heal and rediscover myself. The financial recovery had been better than Lisa had initially projected. The restitution payments from David were regular and substantial, and the sale of our house had eliminated all the debt he'd accumulated in my name. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt financially secure. More importantly, I was building a new career. The skills I'd developed as a crisis communications consultant turned out to be perfectly suited for helping other fraud victims navigate the aftermath of financial betrayal. I'd started taking on clients through referrals from Lisa's firm, and the work was both lucrative and meaningful. You have a unique understanding of what these victims are experiencing, Lisa had told me when she made the first referral. You can help them in ways that traditional financial advisors can't. My first client was a woman whose husband had stolen her retirement savings to fund a gambling addiction. Like me, she'd been completely unaware of the extent of his deception until it was almost too late. Helping her develop a strategy for financial recovery and psychological healing felt like transforming my own trauma into something useful. The therapy I'd started after David's arrest was slowly helping me process not just his betrayal, but my own feelings of guilt and self-doubt. Dr. Rebecca Chen specialized in treating victims of psychological manipulation, and she helped me understand how thoroughly David had gaslit me over the years. Victims of systematic deception often blame themselves for not seeing the signs. Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. But your husband was skilled at manipulation. He gradually conditioned you to accept his explanations and to doubt your own instincts. Learning to trust my own judgment again was perhaps the hardest part of recovery. David's betrayal had shattered my confidence in my ability to read people and situations accurately. If I couldn't recognize that my own husband was living a double life, how could I trust myself to make good decisions about anything? The friendship with Melissa had become one of the unexpected gifts of this horrible experience. We met for coffee every few weeks, two women bonded by shared betrayal but committed to moving forward rather than staying trapped in victimhood. I keep thinking about how different our lives would be if you hadn't found those contracts. Melissa said during one of our meetings, I would have married him. I would have been legally married to someone who was already married. You would have figured it out eventually, I assured her. David's lies were too elaborate to maintain forever. The truth has a way of surfacing. Melissa had thrown herself into her career after the failed wedding, earning a promotion and developing a reputation as one of the most capable marketing directors in her company. Like me, she was discovering strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Sometimes I wonder if David actually did us a favor, she mused. Obviously not intentionally, and obviously the way it happened was traumatic. But I'm stronger now than I was when I believed in fairy tale endings. I understood what she meant. The experience of surviving David's betrayal had revealed capabilities I'd never had to access before. I'd learned to investigate, to strategize, to advocate for myself in ways that had surprised even me. The isolation that had characterized the first months after David's arrest was gradually giving way to new social connections. I'd joined a hiking group and was taking a pottery class at the community college. Simple activities that reminded me there was joy to be found in ordinary pursuits. Dating felt impossible to imagine, though Dr. Chen assured me that would change with time. The idea of trusting someone enough to build a romantic relationship seemed overwhelming when I was still learning to trust my own judgment. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Chen reminded me regularly. Some days you'll feel strong and independent, other days you'll feel angry or sad or confused. All of those feelings are normal parts of processing betrayal on this scale. On the bad days, I reminded myself that I'd survived the worst thing I could imagine. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was building a life that was authentically mine, free from the elaborate lies that had defined my marriage. The apartment was slowly becoming a home as I filled it with things that reflected my actual preferences rather than compromises with a partner's taste. Books I wanted to read, art that spoke to me, Furniture chosen for comfort rather than appearance. For the first time in years, I was learning who Sarah Matthews was when she wasn't trying to be the wife David Matthews wanted her to be. The letter from Melissa arrived on a Thursday morning, nearly a year after David's sentencing. Her handwriting was elegant and careful, the kind that suggested she'd thought deeply about every word before committing it to paper. "Dear Sarah," it began. "I've been meaning to write this letter for months, but I wanted to wait until I was sure of my feelings and my words. I need you to know how grateful I am that you found those wedding contracts and had the courage to stop David's deception before it went any further." I settled into my reading chair by the window, surprised by the emotion that rose as I continued reading. "If you hadn't acted when you did, I would have married a man who was already married. I would have unknowingly become part of his crime. More than that, I would have built my life on a foundation of lies that would have eventually collapsed, probably in an even more devastating way." Melissa went on to describe her therapy journey and her growing understanding of how thoroughly David had manipulated both of us. She'd been working with a specialist in psychological abuse who'd helped her recognize the subtle ways David had isolated her from friends who might have asked uncomfortable questions. "He convinced me that my friends were jealous of our relationship," she wrote. "When my best friend expressed concerns about how quickly things were moving, David suggested she was threatened by my happiness. I started pulling away from people who might have protected me." The letter revealed details about David's manipulation that I hadn't known. He'd encouraged Melissa to quit her job and move in with him, making her financially dependent on him. He'd criticized her family, gradually reducing her contact with people who might have investigated his background. I realize now that he was systematically isolating me, just like he was systematically deceiving you. We were both victims of the same predatory behavior, just at different stages of his plan. Melissa's insight into David's psychology was deeper than mine had been, perhaps because she'd experienced his manipulation from the beginning of their relationship. She could see the patterns more clearly than I could from within my marriage. "I've been thinking about starting a support group for women who've experienced financial and emotional fraud in relationships," she continued. "There are so many of us, but we often feel too ashamed to talk about what happened. I think there's power in sharing our stories and supporting each other's healing." The idea resonated immediately. In my work helping other fraud victims, I'd seen how isolation compounded the trauma of betrayal. Women blamed themselves for not seeing the signs, for trusting too completely, for making themselves vulnerable to manipulation. I called Melissa that evening, and we talked for over 2 hours about her support group idea. By the end of the conversation, we'd decided to co-facilitate meetings. Combining my professional crisis management skills with her marketing expertise and natural empathy, we could call it Truth and Trust. Melissa suggested, "Focus on rebuilding our ability to recognize truth and gradually learn to trust again." Our first meeting was held in the community room of my apartment complex, with just 3 women besides Melissa and myself. Linda had discovered her husband's gambling addiction when creditors started calling about debts she'd never incurred. Janet's fiancé had stolen her inheritance to fund his drug habit. Maria's business partner had embezzled nearly $100,000 from their joint venture. Each woman's story was different in its details but similar in its emotional impact, the shock of discovery, the self-doubt, the feeling of having been fundamentally deceived about reality itself. "The hardest part isn't even the financial loss," Linda shared during our first meeting. "It's not knowing if I can trust my own judgment anymore. If I couldn't tell that my husband was hiding a serious gambling problem, how can I trust myself to make any important decisions?" The group provided something none of us had found elsewhere: understanding without judgment, validation without pity, and practical support from people who'd survived similar betrayals. Melissa proved to be a natural facilitator, creating space for each woman to share at her own pace while gently guiding conversations toward healing rather than dwelling in victimhood. Her own journey from devastated bride-to-be to empowered survivor gave hope to women just beginning their recovery process. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over, she told the group during our third meeting. I thought I'd never be able to trust anyone again, never feel safe in a relationship. I'm not saying I'm completely healed, but I'm no longer defined by what David did to me. The group grew quickly through word of mouth and referrals from therapists and attorneys. Within 6 months, we were running 3 separate groups and had a waiting list. The need for this kind of support was apparently enormous. What surprised me most was how much facilitating these groups helped my own healing. Listening to other women's stories of survival and resilience reminded me that David's betrayal was about his character, not mine. Seeing women gradually rebuild their confidence and self-trust reinforced my own progress. Melissa and I developed a genuine friendship that extended beyond our shared trauma. We discovered we had similar tastes in books and movies, both loved hiking, and shared a dry sense of humor that had been refined by surviving betrayal. It's weird that something so awful led to something so positive, Melissa observed one evening as we planned curriculum for a new group session. I would never choose to go through what David put us through, but I can't deny that it led me to meaningful work and a real friendship. Our alliance had become something neither of us expected, not just mutual support between fellow victims, but a partnership focused on helping others heal from similar traumas. We'd transformed our shared experience of betrayal into a source of strength for other women facing their own devastating discoveries. The thank you letters we received from group members were among the most meaningful feedback I'd ever received. Women who'd felt isolated and ashamed discovered they weren't alone. Those who'd blamed themselves for their partner's crimes learned to recognize manipulation tactics they couldn't have defended against without knowledge they didn't possess. Together, Melissa and I had created something powerful from the ashes of David's betrayal, a community of survivors committed to healing and supporting each other's journey back to wholeness. 1 year later, I sat in my apartment writing in the journal Dr. Chen had encouraged me to keep throughout my healing process. The pages chronicled a journey I could never have imagined when I first discovered those wedding contracts from devastated wife to empowered survivor to advocate for other women. The entry began. Today marks 2 years since I found David's wedding plans. 2 years since my world collapsed and I learned that the man I'd loved for 8 years had been systematically betraying me while planning to marry someone else. But as I wrote, I realized the anniversary wasn't bringing the pain I'd expected. Instead, I felt something closer to gratitude, not for David's betrayal, but for the strength I'd discovered in surviving it. The fraud recovery business I'd built was thriving beyond my expectations. I now had 5 employees and was consulting with law firms across the Pacific Northwest. My expertise in financial fraud recovery had become recognized enough that I was invited to speak at legal conferences and victim advocacy events. You've become something of an expert, Lisa had told me recently. Your combination of professional crisis management skills and personal experience with systematic fraud makes you uniquely qualified to help these victims. The support groups Melissa and I facilitated had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization. Truth and Trust now served over 200 women across 3 states, offering support groups, financial literacy education, and advocacy services for fraud victims. Melissa had relocated to Portland 6 months ago to work on the nonprofit full-time. She'd taken a leave of absence from her marketing career to pursue her master's degree in social work, specializing in trauma recovery. Our friendship had deepened into the kind of partnership that felt both professional and sisterly. We make a good team, she'd said recently. You bring the strategic thinking and I bring the emotional intelligence. Together we can help women who are where we were 2 years ago. The personal growth had been even more profound than the professional success. Therapy had helped me understand that David's betrayal was a reflection of his character, not a judgment on my worth or intelligence. I'd learned to trust my instincts again, to recognize red flags I'd been trained to ignore, and to value my own judgment. Dating had remained off limits until recently, when I'd met someone through the hiking group I'd joined. Tom was a teacher, recently divorced, with a transparency about his past that felt refreshing after years of living with David's deceptions. We were taking things slowly, building friendship before considering romance. I like that you ask direct questions, Tom had told me after I'd inquired about his divorce details during our 3rd hike together. Most people dance around uncomfortable topics. Your honesty is refreshing. The financial recovery had exceeded even Lisa's optimistic projections. David's restitution payments were regular and substantial, and my business income had grown too, the point where I was more financially secure than I'd ever been during my marriage. The house I'd purchased in the suburbs was modest but entirely mine. Chosen and decorated according to my preferences alone. The most unexpected development was a letter I'd received from David 3 months ago, written from prison. It was different from his earlier attempts at apology, more thoughtful, less self-serving. I've been in therapy for over a year now, he'd written. I'm beginning to understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed me to justify destroying your life and Melissa's for my own gratification. I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I can never repair the damage I caused. But I want you to know that I finally understand the magnitude of what I did. I'd shared the letter with Dr. Chen, who'd helped me process my complicated feelings about David's apparent growth. Whether his remorse was genuine or performative for parole purposes didn't matter much to my healing, but it provided some closure to know he'd at least acknowledged the reality of his crimes. The fact that he's in therapy and showing some insight doesn't undo the damage, Dr. Chen had reminded me. But it might mean he's less likely to repeat these patterns with future partners. The journal entry continued. I've been thinking about forgiveness lately, not as something David deserves, but as something I need for my own peace. I'm not there yet, and maybe I never will be. But I've stopped carrying anger as a daily burden. The support group work had taught me that healing looks different for everyone. Some women in our groups had found their way to forgiveness relatively quickly. Others remained righteously angry years after their betrayals. Both responses were valid, and neither was morally superior to the other. What mattered was forward movement, not the specific emotional destination. I was building a life defined by purpose and authenticity rather than by the trauma I'd survived. David's betrayal had become part of my story, but not the defining chapter. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been living a lie without knowing it, my identity entirely wrapped up in being David's wife. Now I was Sarah Matthews, fraud recovery specialist, nonprofit co-founder, survivor, advocate, and gradually, someone learning to love again. The woman who'd trusted completely and been devastated by betrayal had evolved into someone who could love wisely, with boundaries intact and instincts sharp. David had tried to erase me from his life. But instead, he'd helped me discover who I really was beneath the role I'd been playing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New clients who needed help rebuilding after betrayal. New support group members, learning to trust themselves again. But tonight, I felt something I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. Complete contentment with the life I'd built from the ruins of my marriage. The revenge I'd fantasized about in those early days had evolved into something better, a life so fulfilling that David's opinion of it no longer mattered.